The following thrilling story is presented for your enjoyment. This classic work is now in the public domain, making it freely available to be shared and appreciated by all. Some elements may appear outdated or insensitive by today's standards, but we present this work in its original form to preserve its historical context and literary significance. Sit back, relax, and indulge in this timeless tale. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share. Every bit helps this channel grow.
The Lonely Place by John Marvin from Adventures into Darkness, number 13, March 1954. There was something in the old family homestead that terrified him. He came out on the cold, lonely H road just below the rise that led to the house. His first word was a meaningless curse. He hadn't spoken anything else since leaving the bus at Butlersville. Wind whistled past him, and suddenly he stopped and almost sobbed. The fear, the terror had frozen his blood, his soul long ago. He half-turned, ready to abandon everything, ready to run down the half-mile road he'd already traversed, back to Butlersville. In Butlersville, tiny hamlet though it was, there were lights and voices. Out here, near the old family homestead, was only a patch of broken road, vast, shadowy trees, and an ocean of darkness beyond. Beyond, he knew, were just fields, but he couldn't see them. They might hold anything, any terror, any menace. Then he saw the house, and a sword of sheer fright pierced his heart. His teeth chattered. A light was burning in a window on the second floor. Light? In a house empty for 20 years? Then it vanished, and he breathed a sigh of relief as he glanced at the black vault of the skies. The pitchy curtain had parted for just an instant, and the moonlight, breaking through, had glinted off one of the window panes. It was just that, of course, or was it? His heart pounded violently. Again he cursed. Why had Jean insisted they live here after they were to be married in April? She knew he didn't like the place. He knew she did. Jean liked old New England saltbox houses. She had a passion for old things, old American things, spindly, spider-like maple furniture. Yes, the place was charming enough by day. He remembered it as a boy. A brook sparkled down at the edge of a pasture. But at night, from his earliest childhood, he had hated the place at night. He hated everything, all lonely places at night. As a boy, he had lain awake at night and listened to the night noises. They were always there then, in the old house. The creaks on the stairs, the dry rustle in the attic over his bedroom, the very room in which a light had seemed to shine. Sometimes he had screamed, and then his mother would come and tell him it was just his imagination. Walking up the rise toward the house, he laughed harshly. Perhaps it had been his Ugged Har's imagination after all, even the shadows that lay on the floor and which seemed to move and waver like dark fires in a witch lamp. But that was all long, long ago, and now the house was his, and his bride-to-be wanted to live there. The old driveway up which buckboards had coursed led him to the weedy flower beds before the house. Stealthily, he felt in his pocket for the key. If he'd lost it or forgotten it, he could go back, come some other night, when the moon at least would be shining and the cold wind a warmer whisper. For that, he would have to come and spend one night alone in the house he knew well. It was the only way to break the spell that terror had laid on him for 25 of his years. Above all else, he didn't want to play the coward before Jean. He mustn't lose her, Heb knew. If she suspected for an instant he was afraid of lonely places, of shadows, of noises in the night, she'd think much less of him as a man. A pang struck his heart as his fingers closed over the key in his pocket. His legs momentarily weakened, and again he paused. The black bulk of the house was like some evil mound within which hideous things might lurk. Then he shook himself. He was, after all, a man, not a boy, though he might have a boy's fears. Throwing his shoulders back, he walked up the old steps to the door, fitted the key to the lock. The door gave way with rusty rattles. What? The rat that had startled him by its leap from an old table scurried off down the far corridor that led to the kitchen. He came inside, weak, sweating, trembling, and stood there, alone. On the table stood an old kerosene lamp. He picked it up, shook it. It was dry. The wick broke off and fell stonily against the glass wall of the fuel chamber. Then he remembered the flashlight in his pocket. He swept it out, let the clean beam slash like a sword round the room. It was all as the family had left it when they had moved to the city, as his mother had told him it had been. The furniture was old, Richgetti. He shrugged. Jean would adore fixing it. A bitter look froze his face. Yes, the place would be too much for her to resist. There was no escape. No matter how he argued, she'd plead they could, at least, save on rent. Behind him, a board creaked and he spun. There was nothing there, save darkness and dust. And a rustle now, from upstairs. A rustle that was familiar in memory, and which could be made only by something heavier than a rat. He gritted his teeth. This was the test. If he were to be a man, at all, he'd have to climb those stairs to his room, find the emptiness he expected, and exercise terror and fright once and for all. Clenching his chattering teeth, he went up the stairs. It was at the head of the stairs he heard the voices from his old room. A shock of gladness poured through him. These weren't the fears he had imagined as a boy. Voices were real. Behind those doors were crouching, probably, one or two prowlers who had broken into the house to steal. Anger swept through him. He could handle men. He would teach the tramps a lesson. His free fist balled, and he came up against the door and sent it crashing back. Then, as the light beam shot through to the room beyond, he screamed and tried to run. He couldn't. He had always known that if it came to this, he couldn't. He stood there numb. It was logical, he thought. The force of a child's mind was weak, though its imagination might be great. It could people the dark with only weak, small terrors. But the force of a man's mind, coupled with an imagination grown 25 years older and stronger, would give body and weight to vagaries. These had plenty of both. The fears stood outlined in the trembling beam. They were just as he had always imagined them to be. One was tall, one was short, and one was in between. In between. And as they came toward him, they looked as fears always did, with hatred in their eyes and murder in their claws. They reached for him, mouthing words of blood and terror and death, the sounds he had mistaken for those of men.